Before we get started, who here has any relatives in the United States, Canada, European Union? All right. So, all right. So just I figured as much. Who here, if you could get a work visa in the U.S. for free right now by snapping my fingers, who would want one? Yeah. All right. So now, most Americans do not want you to be able to get it that easily. But this is a book about why it would be great for the world as well as for the receiving country, the sending country, if we did actually hand out visas like candy. All right. So just here's some background, which a lot of Americans really do not know because they're in a country where they just take it for granted. So all first world countries strictly regulate immigration. Right? There is no counterexample of a country that does not strictly regulate it. The one that is actually most liberal is United Arab Emirates, where I connected here. So 88% foreign born. But even it is not just a snap of your fingers to get in. Anyone here have relatives in UAE? Oh, wow, okay, so all right, more than I thought there. It is such a small country, but without the immigrants, there'd be almost no one there. Like the actual citizens of UAE, it's under 1 million people. They would not have enough people just to go and man the grocery stores or the taxis if it were not for the immigrants. Now, especially low-skilled workers are especially unlikely to be allowed into first world countries. If I went down to the street and asked people there, anyone here have relatives in the United States or Canada or EU, I think very few hands would be going up because it is much harder for them to get in. As hard as it is for you guys to get in, much harder for them. Right now, this regulation is extremely popular in all the countries that have it. Why? Because most people think it would be a disaster if they did not have it. That's the simple story. What would happen if we let all these people in? We would be overrun. It would be terrible. Right now, there's a lot of research that analyzes the consequences of immigration restrictions. And the main conclusion is that the popular views about what immigration does are unrealistically negative and often extremely so. All right, so just to give you a little bit more background. So the goals of this book. So first goal, to synthesize the evidence. There's a lot of papers. Often the papers are not directly even about immigration. For example, in linguistics, they will study how quickly do people learn languages. When you move to a new country, how long does it take before people become fluent in a new language? When you write a paper like that, the goal isn't to say something about immigration, really. It's just focused on language acquisition. But when you're writing a book about immigration, you realize that is relevant because when someone says, oh, well, they'll never assimilate, it's like, well, why don't we see what actually happens and how quickly people do learn languages? All right, so the descriptive goal is to synthesize a wide body of evidence from many different fields, starting with economics, but also including sociology, political science, philosophy, and more. All right, now, the normative goal is to argue for the radical liberalization of immigration, to say that what is being done is just based upon a totally false view of what's going on. All right. Now, by the way, there are a lot of researchers who don't think that it's real research just to synthesize evidence. I say that it is because if academics don't do it, who will? Right? It's not like a journalist is likely to say, I'm going to go and synthesize a bunch of academic evidence. You'd have to be someone that reads academic research before you could do that. So what I'm trying to do is to actually add some value by saying, look, I'm putting all this research together. I did not write the research, but I am going to snap it all together into a new structure so you can see a new story. And then, so anyway, I say this is greatly undervalued. One of the main things wrong with academia is people who just write papers on narrow topics and never try to sell it to the rest of the world, never argue that it's relevant, don't even care whether it's relevant, to be honest. Also, most people who analyze policy just try to avoid saying anything radical. Like, we can't go and say something like that. That's not scientific. Isn't the really scientific thing to just look at the evidence and then tell people what it says? Say that's the scientific thing. So, like, if most people think that bleeding is a good way to overcome bad health, and that's wrong, like, The moderate thing would be let's reduce bleeding by 10%. So, or how about we just look at what we learned and say stop bleeding people. Right now I can only sketch the evidence, but we do have time for Q&A, so we got a full 90 minutes, right? All right, so that's good. All right, so just to start, what are immigration restrictions? Immigration restrictions are essentially trade barriers. They're what we call non-tariff trade barriers because with a tariff, you can just pay the tax and sell your product. If there is a 1,000% tariff on Mercedes, you are still allowed to say, all right, I will pay the tariff, now give me my Mercedes. Non-trade barriers are things like someone saying it has to be an essential need. And then you have to convince a bureaucrat and he can just say, no, it's not an essential need. And then you may take out your wallet and say, what is it going to take? And you may say, well, that's corruption. Well, corruption's better than strictly enforcing a terrible law. And that is primarily what countries do when they keep out immigrants, is they actually enforce it quite strictly. Has anyone ever heard of anyone bribing their way into the United States? You know, bribing. You heard of someone who bribed their way to get a visa, or?
I mean, I've read a lot of.
Yeah, but you have to. Do you personally know anyone? Don't worry, I won't tell. But yeah, so yeah, it's one thing in the newspaper. The newspaper's job is to report really rare things, but if you've never heard of it in your entire life, it's like, well, probably it's actually does not happen very often. All right, anyway, there are non-tariff trade barriers where, as you may have heard, getting a work visa for the United States is extremely hard. Getting a student visa is extremely hard. Getting a travel visa is extremely hard. You fill out an enormous amount of documents and then you send them in and you wait. And you're like, come on, come on, come on. All right, and normally it'll just be no. There are certain very rare conditions where you are likely to get approved. Like if you've got a US citizen that will marry you, that's good. You can get in with that. Or if you've got a parent who is a citizen and you're under 16, then you can get in. All right, there's not even a quota for that. But for almost everybody else, very hard. Now, what these trade barriers do is create enormous price wedges. Let's see. So most of you have done econ. All right, so I'll just do it. All right. This is standard story about how a tariff works. What does a tariff do? Well, a tariff creates a gap between the price that is paid by demanders and the price that is received by sellers, right? And as a result, we reduce the quantity from there, which would be the market outcome, down to there. And in the process, we destroy all that value, right? All of those gains get banned by the tariff. All right. This is really what an immigration restriction is, except instead of it being a tariff, it's just we're going to strangle supply. We're going to make it very hard to get permission. Right. Now, what's notable is that these trade barriers are extremely strict, and they are also for the world's most important commodity, which is labor. Right. Globally, about 60 or 70% of all income goes to labor. So when you regulate this market, you are doing something much worse than just regulating the market for cars or the market for tobacco or the market for toys. This is the most important market in the entire world. Right now, the price wedges are huge. Right? So my colleague Michael Clemens has done work estimating if you take a random Indian and move him to the US, how much does his income instantly multiply by? I think for India, it's about a factor of 8 on average. So you can make 8 times that income. Now, this varies by your level of skill. So for very skilled workers, it's probably only like 3 times. All right. On the other hand, for very low skilled workers, then more like 10 or 15 times. So you can really easily tell this if you look at what an Uber driver makes here and what an Uber driver makes in the United States. They're doing the same job, right? And then actually it's more extreme than the initial math would tell you, because in both countries, they got to subtract out the price of gasoline. They got to subtract out the rental price of the vehicle. So so once you say, well, there's similar amounts being subtracted, absolutely. So the actual take-home pay of the Indian Uber driver very plausibly is like 1/15th or 1/20th of what it would be in the United States. So estimates of the size of these price wedges are huge. So it's often over 1,000% after you make a lot of different adjustments. If you want to learn more, you can read my colleague Michael Clemens' paper with Lant Pritchett and a third co-author Claudio Montenegro, where they just give estimates for how big is the effect of the restriction on earnings for about 60 or 80 different countries. All right. Now, Michael Clemens has another paper where he reviews estimates of the global cost of all these restrictions. Just think about it this way. The world is strangling the most important market. How bad is it to strangle the most important market? All right, well, let's see. Everyone knows what the word quadratic means, right? Right, so a quadratic function, you double one thing and you multiply the next thing by a factor of 4, right? Well, if you notice that this dead weight loss here is a triangle, well, if you double one side of a triangle, then what do you do to the area of that triangle? Multiply it by 4. All right. If you go and and this is a general rule about tax analysis, when you double a tax, you are quadrupling its burden. When you multiply a tax by 10, you are making the burden worse by a factor of 100. All right, an enormous difference. All right. Now, what Clemens finds is, yes, estimates of how bad the costs are vary, but how they vary, but they're all large. So if you can read here, there's basically 4 estimates. One saying that if you could go and get rid of all immigration restrictions on Earth, so everyone could take a job anywhere, then you'd be multiplying the wealth of humanity, right? So you'd be multiplying GWP, gross world product. Very rarely discussed, but it's a totally sensible concept. It's the production of humanity, right? And if you could just get rid of all barriers to labor mobility, be multiplying it by like a high estimate of 1.47 times the, you'll actually see, well, you'll be adding 147% to the production of the world. Another one, 95% or 96, another one, 67, 122. Roughly speaking, we're talking about a doubling of the production of humanity, right? Which is a big thing. Right now, he also contrasts it with a lot of other kinds of barriers that people have talked about, like estimates of getting rid of all regular tariffs and trade barriers for normal exported products. And those are always in the single digits. Now, 1% of GWP is still an enormous amount, but doubling GWP is an amount that is almost beyond imagination. It is so large. All right. Okay. Normally I deliver these slides in the first world. And so the us is people in the first world. But anyway, but impoverishes the receiving countries. Right? Almost everyone who analyzes immigration policy ignores everything I've just told you, by the way. So when you hear debates about immigration policy in the United States, normally the pro-immigration case is, look, we want to get Albert Einstein, right? We want to get Elon Musk. We want to get these superstars. So we should like immigration. It's like, okay, but what does that have to do with the other with the billions of other people who want to come? All right. So normally pro-immigration people just focus on high-skilled immigration and just sort them, and sometimes just kind of pretending it's all like that, which is ridiculous, of course. All right. But there are some rare people who are skeptical of immigration, but do address the arguments that I've given you. And the main thing that people have said is, when you present them with this, right, is, all right, fine, maybe that's right. Maybe we could double the wealth of humanity, but who cares? Because the gains would just go to you guys, right? What difference does that make to America, right? Why should Americans care if the wealth of humanity increases? Now, this is kind of weird because one of the main people who has said this, Paul Collier, have you heard of Paul Collier? All right. So he wrote a book on immigration called Exodus, which is very critical of immigration and saying we've got to get tough and stop immigration. Also saying nothing really bad has happened yet, but trust me, it's going to get bad, so let's just stop now. But he also has a much more famous book called The Bottom Billion, which is all about how I feel super bad about poor people on the earth and we really got to help them. It's like, how do these two books fit together? It's hard to understand. All right. But yes, that is one. He is another person. Almost all these gains go to immigration, or rather, almost all the gains would go to foreigners, which is very strange if you think about it, because we have a lot of historical experience with large increases in production. It is always true that when production increases by a large amount, the gains are widely shared. All right, so you just think about the Industrial Revolution, being able to mass produce clothing. This does not mean that millionaires then wear a million shirts. Right? What happens with the Industrial Revolution is that you make clothes affordable for normal people so that normal people can afford an additional set of clothes. Fun aside, the word robber in English comes from the German word Raub, which is cloth. And this is from the medieval era when if you just go and rob a peasant in the forest, he's got no money, he's got no jewels. What do you take from the peasant when you put a sword to his throat? Take his clothes, because clothes, one suit of clothes, you might have to work for months in order to get that suit of clothes. So it's very valuable in a primitive period, pre-modern. Now the idea of robbing someone for their clothes is like, well, just give me the money. I don't want your clothes. All right. So similarly with the industrialization of agriculture, that does not mean that farmers or agribusiness eats 100 times as much. It means that food becomes much cheaper for the mass of humanity, right? Or let's think about some other examples like Uber. Is Uber mainly just something that benefits the drivers? Right? There's all the customers that get to enjoy Uber. Or the internet. Has internet just been good for computer programmers? It's like, how could that be? Most of the internet is free anyway, right? Which is pretty amazing when you think about it. It's like all this totally free stuff. For a while, like for about 15 years, I'm like, all right, well, no one's ever going to complain about tech because they just give us free stuff. How could anyone complain about that? But I was so wrong. People's ability to complain exceeds my imagination. People will say, oh, they're taking our data. Like, who cares? No one cares about you or your stupid data. What difference does it make? Whoa, they know what you bought. So, all right. All right, or just think about COVID vaccines. Was that just Big Pharma that profited from the COVID vaccines? Billions of people benefit. These are all very general historical patterns. When there's a large increase in production, it is always widely shared. So the idea that you could have a doubling of the production of the world, while with all of the gains going to foreigners, which of course to you guys, you're not foreigners in your country, but to us, you're foreigners, right? So today I bought my foreign ticket for the Red Fort. So now I'm a foreigner here. But yes, in America, you guys are the foreigners. All right. Now, what does this mean? It means that since immigration restrictions really are drastically reducing global production, they are impoverishing the receiving countries, or really the not receiving countries, the countries that would receive if they allow them to. Now, you're familiar with the phrase trickle-down economics? All right. It is deliberately negative, right? Because it says that there's some enormous gain that goes to a few people and then a little bit trickles down for the rest of us, right? And you might think of this story as trickle-down economics. We let immigrants come, production drastically increases, and then natives get a little bit of it too. But I say no, it is not trickle-down. It is Niagara Falls economics. Anyone, you guys know Niagara Falls is the most amazing waterfall on the United States, also Canada. It's on the border. Right, so it looks like that. And if you're wondering what this is, in the past there were idiots who would go over the waterfalls in barrels, like a wooden barrel. You get in and just well, sometimes they died. Yes, yeah, that's why they were idiots. Yes, sometimes they died, sometimes they lived. But anyway, it's harmless to do it in a cartoon. But we're not talking about trickle-down economics. It is a flood of wealth. A giant flood of wealth. All right, now what are we losing? So who here has been to Dubai or Abu Dhabi? All right, so that's like, I was just there and it's like, yeah, this is what I'm talking about, people. This is it. This is a country which without immigrants, there'd be nothing here. There'd be under 1 million people with a bunch of, and even if they managed to go and drill all the oil, basically there'd be a bunch of millionaires with no one to spend the money on. You'd have to go and pay a millionaire to deliver your pizza. Right, that's really what it would be like there. Like, it would be a crazy economy where everyone is fabulously rich, but what can you even spend the money on? because there's no one there that actually to go and do the service sector jobs that you would normally, a rich person would hire someone to do. Right, so if you take a look there and to see the incredible cities that immigration built and sustains compared to what they could have done with the people that are natively there, again, which is almost no people there. Right? I mean, of course, they also couldn't have drilled the oil and the natural gas without massive immigration. Right? They needed all of those foreigners to go and help them extract the wealth, make the citizens of the country fabulously rich, while also amazingly enriching the 88% of the population that has immigrated there. Now, what are we, again, the potential receiving countries losing? So tons of cheap products. So you guys know about Walmart and Costco. These are the American superstores, right? These are places where you get large quantities of really cheap products at great prices.
And you get lost.
Yes, and you may get lost, yes. I always tell non-Americans that if you want to understand America, don't go to San Francisco, don't go to New York City, get in a car, drive out to a suburb, and go to a Costco. And then you will see what Americans love about their country. All right, most Americans actually do not really like New York or San Francisco. They might visit it, but it's like, this is like, just too expensive, and it's too crowded, and it's got like too much traffic. Now, like what Americans really like is a suburb with a Costco, where you can go there and fill your giant American car with a giant pile of stuff for almost no money. That's what Americans like, right? And yet, of course, we could do a lot more of this. We could have much more like this, as when it's like, how could it be more? Like, go to Dubai and see how much more you could do if you had the labor of the world ready there to go and cooperate with you on your plans, right? So we've got greater mass production of goods. We've got tons of cheap services, Uber for everything, right? Also, this connects somewhat to what we're doing. Large increases in US real estate values, at least in the short run, because almost all real estate is owned by Americans in America. Almost all American real estate is owned by Americans. And so when those prices go up, those gains are going to Americans. All right. Furthermore, of course, there's also a big change in or gain in entrepreneurship and innovation. Not all of which, in fact, most of which is not high skilled. Most of it is not high skilled. People love to talk about immigrants being involved in the founding of Google and things like that, and that's great. But like really what most immigrant entrepreneurship is like starting an Afghan restaurant, right? And I've had a bunch of gone to a number of restaurants here where Americans would love them, and quite possibly the owner of that restaurant would really like to get a visa to move to the United States and open that restaurant there. Or maybe just to have two restaurants. Keep one here, open one there, but we don't get to enjoy that. All right, now, what about the effects on native wages and jobs? Right, which is really the first argument that most people in receiving countries say. Like, they will take our jobs, they will hurt our wages. The main thing to say here, yes, pardon? Sorry, was there something there? Okay. All right. So the number one most fundamental principle of economics, which you probably have heard, but I'll tell you again anyway, just in case. The secret of mass consumption is mass production. The secret of mass consumption is mass production. When you produce more stuff, living standards are higher. This is the most reliable predictor of living standards around the world. Countries where people consume a lot of stuff are countries where people produce a lot of stuff. The only good exception is Equatorial Guinea, which I won't go into. But this is the heart of what's going on with economic growth. To get living standards in a country up, you've got to get production in the country up as well. Redistribution is not a way to raise living standards in general because, by definition, it is taking some from some people and giving it to others. You need to actually increase the amount of stuff that is produced. So, yes?
Yeah, does it matter where the production gains are coming from? Is it from productivity increase or is it from, let's say, monetary easing and stuff like that?
Well, let's see. I mean, in a sense, like whatever increases production is raising living standards. I mean, you might be saying, well, what if we could go and say and just work 7 days a week? We would raise GDP per capita, but we'd be giving up leisure, right? So yeah, so like GDP, it's not a perfect measure of well-being, but it's good, but not perfect.
No, what I meant was if without productivity increase we try to increase production, then it's likely to be inflationary, and
Ah, I see. Okay, yeah. So you're thinking about, well, let's talk about that in the Q&A. So like, I'd say like basically for any issue of long-run growth, demand side factors are really just not relevant anyway. It's the kind of thing that you may worry about over the course of a year or two, but no country has ever demanded its way, printed money into prosperity or anything like that. Okay. All right. Now, why does this matter? Well, because of this. If you are doing something that dramatically increases the production of humanity, and in particular the production in the country that you're in, those resources are going to be enjoyed by people that are largely in that country, especially services, which is 80% of modern economies. Right? If an Indian restaurant opens in my area, you guys will not be eating there, right? It will be people in the United States that are eating there. So anyway, why bring up this rule that the secret of mass consumption is mass production? Because this is the best rule for understanding the actual overall effect of any policy. Say, well, does the policy increase production? Then this is raising living standards in general. If it is going and reducing production, then it is hurting living standards in general. Anytime someone is thinking about a change, like let's ban tractors, that could be good for some people, bad for others. Good for some people, bad for others, but since you are producing less food, it is bad overall. All right. And this is what I say is the general thing to be thinking about. It's true that if you are directly competing with an immigrant for a job, that's bad for you. However, what if you are consuming the products that the immigrant makes? That is good for you. The net effect can be understood by saying, well, what is the overall effect on total production? Right? And more specifically, you guys are familiar with the difference between complements and substitutes? All right, so a substitute would be like there's another economics professor that can compete with me. Right? A complement would be, say, a graduate student that makes it easier for me to do my work. When economists have analyzed the effect of immigration, what they've realized is a lot of immigration, a lot of immigrant workers are actually complements to natives rather than substitutes. You can really, again, see this in a place like Dubai and say, yeah, there probably aren't that many world-class architects in Dubai. So what happens when you allow in immigrant architects, right? Does this go and take jobs away from people in Dubai? No, it creates jobs for people in Dubai because since those architects are there, you can make the Burj Khalifa. And without that architect, you wouldn't be able to do it. So you bring them in and actually this raises the productivity of the other workers because their skills are in fact complementary. And I am talking to Americans, I have these little things I will add. Say, look, if you think Americans should get even more, well, how about say you can come, I'm stamping your work visa, yes, but you do have to pay extra taxes. Or you do have to pay an extra fee. Just imagine if instead of going through the entire horrible visa process, you could just pay some money and it would instantly give it to you, right? Like imagine that you had two routes. One is the normal route and the other one is give me your credit card, right? And okay, you now have your visa, the end, you're ready to go. Yes?
In some sense, does it an investment visa, which the US does offer, allow you to do that?
Great question. So the answer is, first of all, that price is set very high, like $1 million. But second of all, it actually is still not like that. You actually have to start the business. And I think the visa, you have to go through and convince someone you've got a real business idea and the capability of doing it. So it's not just paying $1 million. It's basically $1 million plus you have to at least pretend that you've got some business idea and convince someone that you could do it. So it's not just like paying people. To some degree. But here is what's important. The gains that we're talking about are so large, like if we're talking about multiplying earnings by a factor of 8, that like any plausible cash price you could actually earn back in just a few years in the United States. So like if you could come there safely, with certainty, with no hassles, no fear of getting deported, someone saying, oh, well, you got in a traffic accident, so we're sending you back for life. That's the correct punishment for that. This is something where the amount of money you have and the amount of money you get, and then also, once the transaction is legal, guess what else happens? Lenders are willing to lend you money for legal transactions. Right? If it's illegal, then there's always the fear of, first of all, I could get punished for lending someone money for an illegal transaction. But second of all, also, if they are already a criminal, will I ever get repaid? What's going to happen? just to go and open this up to offering a clear price means that the market is suddenly able to function much better. But yeah, of course it does undermine it a bit. Yes. Yes. Although remember, of course, a lot. Usually you can get in it, but that does not mean that you're going to be able to stay and work. You might be able to do it, but you may have also heard the number of H-1B visas in the U.S. every year is very low. So it's like just a couple 100,000 H-1B visas. So I mean, I'd say really your better bet is to come to America and marry an American citizen. So get the student visa and then just be extremely charming. Just turn on the charm. And or lower your standards, or some combination, high charm, low standards, and that was probably a better bet than trying to get an H-1B. Yeah, Chinkia?
Doesn't education serve that purpose? Like when people go for a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, they pay huge tuition fees, and they easily get visas and then they get job opportunities.
So again, the answer is that improves your odds, but there are just not that many of these H-1B visas in the United States. So like the people they probably got lucky.
Student visas are more.
No, but
Yes.
you only get a 2-year stay.
Yes.
It depends on your
Right.
degree.
Yes. All right. But in any case, now by the way, remember I keep going back to United Arab Emirates. Well, guess what their policy is? They 88% foreign born, and they are much more open to charging people for things, or specifically, actually, it's more on the next slide. They are happy to let people in and then say, yes, you don't get any government money, we don't get any help, you're here to work. All right. Now, George Borjas, who is actually an immigrant from Cuba to the United States, he is the most intellectually respected critic of immigration in the United States. And his main criticism of this, which is correct, is that to get that multiple of GWP, you would have to have billions of people move. So, and that's true. And then he says, okay, so this whole argument is really stupid because, look, either estimates are way too high because not that many people will come, or estimates are way too high because moving billions of people suddenly will just collapse society. All right, so either way, everything Bryan just told you is wrong, and you can forget it and go home. All right, but Paul Collier, who is, as I said, another very noted critic of immigration, he actually accidentally gave a great answer to this challenge, where he said, look, the way that immigration works, it's not that either nobody comes or everybody comes in immediately. Rather, it is like a snowball, right? So you got snow in the Himalayas, right? So sometimes I'm in countries so hot that I'm like, you understand snow, or you've seen cartoons with snow. All right. So we have this verb to snowball, which means you start at the top of the Himalayas with a little snowball, and it starts rolling and rolling and gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? He calls this diaspora dynamics, and the theory is sound. All right. So actual migration begins slowly, and then it snowballs and gets big, which means that, first of all, billions will come if it's legal. But second of all, it's not going to be the chaotic disaster of everybody coming at once. Instead, there's a lot of time to go and get ready, right? You can look at Dubai and say, wow, they multiplied their population more than tenfold, actually, because there was some native population growth, and maybe like 50 years, right? So it is not hard to go and multiply your population tenfold in 50 years. It's like, wait a second. If you do that twice in a row, your population grows 100 times, and yet it never actually needs to seem crazy minute by minute. It's not like in any day you can't drive in the streets because it's so crowded with new arrivals. We have a great example in the United States. Who has heard of Puerto Rico? Or Puerto Rico? All right. Yes. Tenemos puertorriqueños aquí? 9? No? Okay. Sorry, I was mixing German and Spanish. But anyway, so after the Spanish-American War, the United States annexed Puerto Rico. And then there was a Supreme Court case that said that there had to be open borders with Puerto Rico. All right. And then here is the data on the number of migrants that actually came in each decade. So the first legal decade, only 2,000 Puerto Ricans came. It would be easy to say, okay, well, Puerto Ricans just don't want to leave. They don't want to live in America. They don't want to have higher wages and better living standards. They're just totally happy where they are. All right. And then the next decade, 11,000 come. Huh. Well, like 5.5 times that. All right, well, like a few of them want to come, I guess. And then 42,000 come the next decade. Then there's the Great Depression. Then things are terrible, so not that many come. But the 1950s, 151,000 Puerto Ricans come. Then 470,000 come. All right, then 214. Finally, by here, we've reached at least a temporary equilibrium, although actually there was another big spike in the last 2 decades. And now most people of Puerto Rican heritage live in the mainland United States. Puerto Rico is also now almost the richest island in the Caribbean, by the way. It would be the poorest state in the United States if it was a state. So the poorest state is Mississippi, but Puerto Rico would be worse than that. And yet compared to the other surrounding islands, Puerto Rico is heaven. All right, so Borjas is wrong. Right, and actually, by the way, you can also see this very nicely with Indian immigration. So there's virtually zero Indian immigration in the United States in 1960. There was actually a Supreme Court case where there was a guy from India who got to the US Supreme Court and he said, I am actually an Aryan. I am Aryan, I am white, and so I should not I should not be barred from, like there were 2 laws. One was called the Asiatic Barred Zone. So anyway, it should not apply to me because I am of pure Aryan descent, and so I'm of the same race as you, and like I should be let in. And yeah, that didn't work for him. right. But anyway, there's very small number. But then what happened is that a small number got in on student visas, on work visas, through marriage, often facilitated by student or work visas. And then I think you probably know at least as well as I do how the system works. Then next step is family unification, right? And there are a bunch of different standards, but the key feature of the 1965 Immigration Act in the United States is that it included brothers and sisters as family. So normally family unification is like your children, your spouse, maybe your parents, but not brothers and sisters. Since it allowed for brothers and sisters, this meant that once you get in and you get your citizenship, then you can sponsor a brother. Then it's not just you can bring in your spouse and your kids. You can bring in your brother or sister. And once they're a citizen, they can bring in their spouse. And that spouse can bring in their brothers and sisters. And so on. And that is actually the main way I think that most of your relatives that got into the US, you need some people to do the work visa or the student visa because that's where you start. But once you're there, then you can do family unification, which is the fundamental basis of US immigration law. Something like 70 or 80% of all immigration to the US is based on family unification and not student, and so not being a student, not being a worker, nothing like that. Okay. All right. Right, so why not? If we could go and massively increase the wealth of humanity as well as the wealth of the receiving country, and again, if you've got any doubt, just go to Dubai, go to Abu Dhabi and say, look, without the immigrants, these people would be poor. They might have a giant bank account full of oil money, but what would they spend it on? Right, you need the immigrants to actually make the country for you. Otherwise, it's just rich people selling services to other rich people. What kind of, that's not a good way to be rich, right? Okay, so why not? All right, so I am very well aware, I am painfully aware, because whenever I debate immigration, I always lose. I always lose. All right, how do I know? Well, anytime there's before and after voting, I always lose, right? And it's like, damn it, like, why do I keep losing? Well, the answer is that none of the actually intellectually sound arguments appeal to people. The good arguments are not persuasive. People are not interested in numbers. Saying that we could go and get like $90 trillion a year of gains. It's like, I might as well be saying $90,000 of gains. They just don't care about numbers. Now, of course, most people just don't care about numbers in general. You may listen to most political arguments and realize, wow, these people don't have any idea how many people live in this country. They don't have any idea how many people are on Earth. Like, they don't have any idea like which industries are big or small. They don't know anything really. So, and of course, that's American political debates too. You can listen to these debates like, why are you even talking about this stuff? It's like, well, I'm talking about it to win. It's like, well, why can you win complaining about people eating cats? It's like, so, well, that's what a loser would ask. A winner just says, perfect, cats, and let's talk about the cats. All right. But anyway, also there's the people that just don't think in terms of numbers. However, there are definitely smarter social scientists who do understand the numbers. And once they do this, all right, fine, you've got this very large effect in global production, but there's some offsetting concerns. All right, reasonable point. Although, notice, if on the benefit side we've got a doubling of GWP, then for any kind of cost-benefit analysis to become unfavorable, you can't just go and say, well, like, there might be some loss of our culture and there'd be some burdens on the schools. Like, look, we're talking about $90 trillion a year gains, so don't bother me with those little details. Like, you got to come up with $90 trillion of losses. What have you got? And yeah, it's very hard to come up with losses like that. All right. So topping the list. Yes.
So the culture argument,
Mhm.
and I've heard that in the white fight a bit.
Mhm.
People say that what makes these countries as successful as
Mhm.
they are is the culture and the institutions that those
Mhm.
cultures support. And then once immigration happens, the culture will no longer be the same, and the institutions that make them prosperous will sort of collapse.
Right. So yeah, that collapse word is key.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, if it's true that immigration would collapse the United States, then yeah, then we're not doubling GWP. We're reducing GWP. On the other hand, what if the culture gets 3% worse? Which sounds like a much more likely scenario, right? Or, of course, maybe our culture actually would be improved by immigrants. For example, in the United States, Indian Americans have the most stable families of any ethnicity in the entire country. It's like, maybe Americans should learn from Indians so that kids can grow up in stable homes. Right? Maybe we should go, and instead of complaining about them messing up our culture, say we messed up our own culture, let's learn from a culture that works. All right. Yes, but the key issue is magnitude, right? So when someone says this could mess up our culture, which could lead to disaster, like, technically true, but what is the probability that would actually lead to disaster? Like, is it 1 in a billion? Well, actually, we're facing many risks that are much larger than that, which we just live with. Right? What are the odds that the internet leads to a cultural collapse? I think it's more than 1 in a billion anyway. Right? I mean, you just know, like, what happened to Europe after the printing press was developed. Massive, like about a century of religious warfare, probably pretty closely connected to the printing press, actually, because once you could print the books, people could read the Bible themselves, and then they say, hey, the Bible says that God agrees with me, not you, and if you don't think so, oh, well, I've got a bunch of friends who agree with me, and let's kill that heretic. And, and that really was what happened to Europe for about a century, just bathed in the blood of religious warfare. But, of course, does not mean printing presses in general are bad. Right? All right, so the main complaints people have, there's protecting taxpayers, protecting culture, and protecting liberty. So how weighty are the objections? All right, so protecting taxpayers, just to start, part of the story is definitely true. So the U.S. welfare state does pay more to do nothing than most Indians earn from working hard all year. So that's just true. All right. Therefore, the argument goes, immigrants come to abuse the system. It's like, well, maybe, but once you're in the U.S., you're no longer comparing what you can get on welfare in the U.S. to what you would earn from working in India. You're probably comparing what you would get from welfare in the U.S. to what you get from working in the United States, which, again, generally will look better. All right, now, key fact about the U.S. welfare state, which I'm guessing is true in India too, it's true in all the other countries I know of, most redistribution is actually not going to the poor anyway, it is going to the old. So, like, do you have a government retirement system here? Yes. So, yes or no? But so it's not like it's not a universal one where you just get 65 and the government starts giving you money. All right. So every first world country prioritizes the elderly, right? So,
like we have a pension, but it's mostly for government.
Okay. Yeah. So almost all first world countries have a system where everybody, whether you work for the government or not, you get free money from the government once you are old enough, with a few rules, but the rules are actually so loose that virtually everybody gets the money. And these pension programs are actually the largest kind of redistribution the government does. So normally we're paying at least twice as much for the elderly as we're paying for the poor. Right? So once you understand this basic fact about the welfare state, it's like, well, normally immigrants are going to be young, not old. And the better predictor of being dependent on the government is actually age, not income. All right, so that is a big feature of the welfare state. So now I don't have time to go over all the numbers, and this is definitely something that hardly anyone wants to go over. I did go over it in a lot of depth. But Normally, when people are trying to figure out what is the burden of immigrants on the welfare state, they consult a philosophy, which is one of the worst ways in the world to do math of any kind, right? To go and say, well, like as a believer in behavioralism, I think that the number that 1 + 1 = 5. It's like, all right. Now, look, that's not the way that you do math. Math requires actually getting the numbers and doing the difficult work. And also, if you're trying to understand the real world, it's like, okay, I've added up these numbers. Are they really the right numbers? Do they include everything that should be included? Do they exclude things? Do they double count things? These are all the things you should be doing. But anyway, there's almost no serious researcher for the US that finds a large negative fiscal effect of immigration for the right now. All right. So yeah, these numbers actually ignore those. Those actually turn out to be wrong. So I did make a mistake, and so I do have a blog post fixing that. But furthermore, like if you like, most people just say like it's just crazy to believe that immigrants could be on average a fiscal positive. Well, besides the fact that generally they're showing up when young, and we are focusing our redistribution on the old. But another key fact is that a lot of government spending is what we call non-rival. That means the cost does not depend on population. Right? So if the US had a baby boom, would it make sense to say, well, now that we have a baby boom, we need more nuclear weapons to protect the babies? It's like whatever you believe about defense, having a bunch of extra babies does not mean that you need to go and change what you're spending on defense, right? And the same goes for many other government many other things the government does. So when you are figuring out fiscal effects, you need to be saying, well, which expenses actually go up as a result of immigration, which ones actually are invariant to population or almost invariant. Okay, now finally, even if this complaint were true, why can't you just be Dubai? Why can't you just say welfare states for natives, oil money goes to natives, and immigrants are here to work? Why can't you say that? Well, that's unequal. It's perfectly equal to say you can never come here. That's fine. That's equality is if you're born in India, stay in India. But inequality is you come to the US and you don't get the same benefits as natives, right? Which is a bizarre moral standard, I gotta say. All right, now protecting American culture. Now your question is sort of combining what I'll call culture with politics and policy, right? But a lot of what people mean by culture, it's not even like tax policy or regulation. It's just, look, we're a certain kind of country, they're different, and we don't want to be around those people. All right, so like a lot of it starts with language. So there's a lot of complaints like immigrants just won't learn the language. Okay, and then there's so they won't learn the language, or they wear strange clothes, right? Or they or they commit crime at a higher rate. That's the more serious one, right? Now, just to back up, let's see, do I have the? Yes, I do actually. All right, this is one of my favorite pages in the book. All right, there's a lot of people on the internet who do not like me, and one of the things they've said about me is Bryan Caplan is such a moron. He believes in magic dirt. He believes that you can take an illiterate Afghan goat herder, fly him to the United States, he touches his foot to the ground, and then whoo, suddenly he becomes an investment banker, speaks fluent English, and just wants to go and watch HBO. All right, so that's what Bryan thinks. And what I've said is no, that's actually not what I think. I say I do believe in something else that you could call magic. I believe in magic culture. What is magic culture? Well, the first thing is the lesser magic. Lesser magic is you can fly an illiterate Afghan goat herder to the United States, and in a week, he can be washing dishes in an Afghan restaurant and be a valuable member of society. Just someone has to wash the dishes, and he can do it. But here's the really amazing thing. The children of that illiterate Afghan goat herder grow up in the United States, and they do speak fluent English, and actually may become a doctor or an investment banker, right? And this is not just hypothetical. So my favorite Afghan restaurant in town, so run by my good friend Daoud. So he escaped from the horrible war there, I think the 70s or 80s. So he just works in a restaurant. His English is pretty good, but he just manages a restaurant. But he's got a daughter who's a doctor. They've got like 8 kids. So he's got like a bunch of success stories, right? And the idea that when he showed up in the United States that he could have a kid who would become a doctor would have just seemed crazy to people. It's not crazy. It happened, and it's not that rare because there is an enormous negative effect on someone's development of having to grow up in Afghanistan. Yes.
Like I do know of an organization that actually trains. I mean, that's for immigration to Germany,
Mhm.
So they train sort of, we can say semi-skilled or not very skilled labor. They teach them German and they take them to Germany. So
Mhm.
people actually learn the language before
Yes.
they
Right.
work that hard to
Mhm.
actually get in there. And they
Right.
really want to.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so, of course you can do that too, but the truth is, for an adult to learn a foreign language fluently is hard, right? It is very hard. The good news is you don't really have to even speak the language of the country you're in fluently to work there. Actually, so when I was in Emirates, they told me that you cannot get by very well in Emirates speaking only Arabic. The actual language of the native people really has been supplanted by English because they let in so many immigrants. And English is something that so many other people speak that it naturally becomes the focal language. But of course that's rare. But anyway, so here, if you take a look at the panel, you'll see that we actually have Uncle Sam baptizing a baby in the water of the United States. And then you see he goes in with a white robe and he comes out red, white, and blue. All right, so that's the story. Yes?
Just back on that
Okay.
story.
Mhm.
Right? This story
Mhm.
holds a lot more true, like a lot truer for the United
Mhm.
States than it does for, say, Europe. Europe is actually abysmal at acculturating people.
So,
and I mean, the case study that you can take is basically, say, Muslim migrants to Europe versus Muslim migrants to United States. Very, very, very different stories.
So I will agree that the United States does it better than Europe. I totally disagree that it is abysmal, right? So if I have been all over Europe, and I'll say you see Muslim immigrants going and working all kinds of jobs there. That you see that they do acquire the language, and furthermore, so a lot of this depends upon saying, well, for the assimilation to be good, it has to be nearly perfect. Right? It's like, well, what would be a reasonable amount of assimilation to expect? So I had a student who went and looked at the share of Muslims born in the UK who remain Muslims when they're adults, and came up with 75%. All right, is that high assimilation or low assimilation? I say that being born Muslim and having a 25% probability of saying, yeah, I don't belong to that religion anymore in adulthood is a crazy high rate of assimilation. And especially when you realize that this is a continuum, that's people that are willing to say, yeah, I disaffiliate. And then the next thing besides disaffiliating is saying, yeah, I'm still Muslim, whatever, right? And so on. I think that a lot of, so actually most of the perception of how bad assimilation has been in Europe, it doesn't come from looking at statistics, it comes from looking at the media. And what is the job of the media? Is it to show you the statistically accurate picture of the world? Is that what journalists do? Right? No. What is their job? Is their job to go and give you a good feel for the good and the bad in the world? No. The job of the media is to find the worst thing that happened and make sure that everybody hears about it. And not even worse measured by any reasonable metric, but just what will make people angriest, what will get people talking. So when I hear about Haitians are eating cats in America, Haitian immigrants are eating cats in America. It's like most people say, well, is it true? We need to investigate this. And my reaction is even if it was true, who cares? It's like, how many cats? What is the maximum number of cats? And weren't 10 times that many cats run over by cars yesterday? So why are we even talking about this? Moving on. I never want to hear about this again for as long as I live, please. But yeah, I don't run the media, and so the media will say, people want to hear about the cats, so let's tell them about the cats. Now, again, I don't want to say that Europe does not have some problems.
My argument is not that Europe is worse off. My argument is
no, that Europe is worse at assimilating. So I'll agree. Yes. Europe is worse at assimilation than the U.S. and Canada, but not terrible, not abysmal, just worse.
But just for an example, right? Even if it's somebody migrating to U.S., they in 5 years, or at least their kids, would identify as Americans. I think it's people don't really, even one generation later, it's very hard for people to identify as, say, Germans. If they've migrated from, say, Algeria or somewhere.
Right. So obviously there are many different measures of assimilation that you could use. So again, the most objective one is just language acquisition. All right. So if you're born in Germany, the odds that you'll speak fluent German are very high. Right. So maybe not quite as high as learning English in the U.S., but still very high. And then how about things like, do you actually have a job where you're self-supporting? Do you want to go and fight for ISIS? That would be one. That would be another one, right? A lot of attention. Hundreds of Muslim immigrants to the EU returned to go and fight for ISIS. All right, well, tens of millions didn't. So it's like, that's worth pointing out.
You're only making the case for entry and work permits, right? You don't care if they're citizens.
Well, that's a fair question. So, to my mind, the main case for citizenship is just that you can't get deported later, right? So, but I will say, like, almost all the gains just come from being able to live and work there, and yes, in fact, like the value that people themselves put on being able to vote. This is a little aside. So, like, one of the best ways to go and get Americans upset is to go and say you should have to pay some money to vote. Right? I have one paragraph in my first book just saying, that's an interesting idea. And I've gotten more questions about the one paragraph than any other paragraph in the entire book. All right. And why is this? Here's my story. People are really upset about this because they realize that people will not pay much money to vote because most people barely care. That's the problem. It's like if you charge $100 to vote, hardly anyone would do it. But it's really important. Trust me. It's like it's the most important thing about being an American is be able to vote. Also, I would rather get dinner at McDonald's than pay that money to vote. All right, but I want to make sure we got enough time. Let's see. So we start. Let me move on, and then we'll save questions for the end. Okay. So anyway, just when we start with the most objective measures of culture, language acquisition, there it is indeed very high. Spanish speakers are usually seen as being the worst learners of English. But when you take a look at them, over 90% of second generation Mexicans speak fluent English, right? The main way that Spanish speakers are different in the United States is they are much more likely to retain their parents' language for another generation. Whereas, say, Indian parents standardly will be upset their kids forget or just refuse to learn or speak the parents' language. Actually, I do have a panel in the book where there is a Indian parent. An Indian immigrant parent. So I don't have it here. Actually, I wish I had it. It's one of my favorite panels. So basically, it's a panel. The left panel says what immigrants' parents never say, and it's like, I'm just so glad that my kids have so much appreciation for my culture. They aren't interested in the United States at all. All they want to talk about is cricket, and they speak Hindi perfectly, and they're teaching it to their kids. It's just so wonderful. I just love the way that there's been no assimilation of my kids. All right. So that's what immigrant parents never say. And on the other panel, what immigrant parents always say, it's just terrible. They have no interest in our culture at all. They when I speak to them in Hindi, they talk back to me in English. Like his grandkids don't speak the language at all. They don't have any interest in this. Now my editor actually said, well, you shouldn't put this in because it's offensive to people. And I says, look, it's true, so I want to say it. And they did let me do it. That assimilation is quite high. Now, one other thing. A lot of times when social scientists are measuring cultural assimilation, it'll be through self-reported questions like, how important is religion in your life? And then you might say, so if you go to Saudi Arabia, there's something called the World Value Survey where they're asking the same questions all over the world. All right. So you might go to Saudi Arabia and say, how important is religion in your daily life? And say 80% of Saudis say, very important. Then you come over to the United States and talk to second generation Saudi immigrants and ask them how important is religion in your life, and maybe they give the same answer, 80%. All right? But is the religion's very important in my life from a Saudi perspective the same as religion is very important in my life from an American perspective? A lot of the way that people are likely to answer these questions is by comparing themselves to other people in their country to get an idea of what is the normal level and then comparing themselves to that. So I'd say that even if you don't even see a change in the responses, that is hiding a lot of the true assimilation because to some degree people are measuring what counts as a lot compared to other people around them. Okay. Now, another one that social scientists have talked about a lot is trust. We'll just do that in the Q&A, but we'll talk about it more if you're curious. There's been a crazy amount of research on the self-reported question, how much do you think you can trust people? And it's a lot, kind of, or not, or barely at all. All right, so typical question. There's 1,000 papers written on this question, right, and analyzing this data, right? And the concern is that if we import people from countries with low trust, that's going to mess up our trust. Most people who do not work on this think it's a bizarre question and are amazed that anyone spends so much time thinking about it, but we can if you want. Now, something that I think is a much better point. I think someone was already you're already mentioning over there, learning German before you come to Germany. One of my students talked about. Well, actually, let me back up. The person that I've debated about immigration more times than anyone else is named Mark Krikorian. He runs the Center for Immigration Studies. It is probably the most prominent anti-immigration think tank on earth. And one of the things that he said that seemed bizarre at the time, but I'm going to tell you, is that, look, immigrants are like donuts. Immigrants are like donuts. You all know donuts, right? Homer Simpson, donuts. All right. Like, how are they like donuts? See, look, when you're young, you can eat all the donuts you want. You can stuff your face with donuts and you don't get fat and it's fine. But if you keep eating donuts when you're 50 years old, you'll be a big fat pig. All right, same thing with immigrants. When you got a young country, you can take them in, they're fine. But once you're a mature country, then immigrants are very dangerous and you shouldn't let them in. It's like, okay, yeah, but like why? And then when pressed, it's like, okay, well, the United States used to be really good at assimilation and now we're really bad. And it's like, and a lot of it is that in the 19th century, we had very high transportation costs, very high communication costs. So basically, when you move from Sicily to the United States in 1900, you're probably never going to see your family again. So you are not going to go back. It's too expensive. It's too hard. You're going to move to the United States permanently. And then also, you're never going to talk to them again. There's no, like you can send them letters. That's all your communication is going to be. So in the old days, when transportation communication were really bad, you leave a country and you cut the link almost entirely, and then of course you've got to assimilate. You got nothing else to do. Whereas in the modern world, we got great transportation, great communication, so an immigrant can move to the United States and still mentally remain back home. Right? I have a colleague whose wife is from Taiwan, and she has no interest in anything in the United States. She just watches Taiwanese television all the time, talks to her friends in Taiwan all the time. She couldn't care less what's happening in the United States. She's mentally still there, which was just not possible in 1900. All right, now my reply to this is, look, first of all, you're right. It is much easier to move to a country and not assimilate than it used to be. That's true. And that's because of improved transportation and communication. But you're only looking half the story. The other half of the story, it is also now much easier to assimilate before you ever migrate. Right now, you can be in Sicily, you've never been to the United States, and due to modern transportation and modern communication, you can have visited, you can have seen it, you know its culture from media, you can contact people. And I have a student who gave this a great name, pre-assimilation. Pre-assimilation. Everyone in this room is a great example, right? You are people who, if you got your work permit, you wouldn't need to spend 10 years learning English and working as a janitor and then figuring out how to go and get the right credentials to do the job you actually want to do. You are ready to go and start working in your chosen profession almost immediately. You are pre-assimilated, and by some simple measures, there's probably about 1 billion people that are all on Earth that do not live in countries where English is the main language, who are ready to immediately migrate and start working in English-speaking countries. All right, let's see. On crime, a quick result. Immigrants are less criminal than Americans, but more criminal than Europeans, right? And why is that? Because Americans are really criminal. Americans have very high crime rates. Native Europeans have really low. Immigrants are in the middle. All right. Now, finally, even if this complaint about culture were true, why not just go and let people in if they can go and show fluency, if they can show familiarity with the culture? Why not just do that? Okay. All right, now, protecting, so actually, let me hold questions and then finish, and then we'll do all the questions. All right, protecting American liberty. Particularly among conservatives and libertarians, there's an idea of the United States already has much better policies than the rest of the world, which I agree with. All right, so, all right, fine, good point. Now, of course, there's plenty of people who would say Americans have terrible policies and we're awful. But anyway, it's like, well, then how is it that it's the country is so much better than so many other countries to live in? Why do people want to move to a country that sucks? But, I mean, one thing that's interesting is that whenever I'm on pro-immigration panels with American leftists, they immediately start getting very uncomfortable because I start talking about how people want to come to the U.S. because things are so much better here. And they say, no, they don't. Things aren't terrible. Things are terrible here. I'm like, well, then why do they want to come? Well, Look, the important thing and things are terrible here. It's like, seems odd that there's so much desire to move to such a terrible place because in their hearts, they just don't like the way that things are in the United States. All right. But anyway, the most popular objection is that immigrants come from what we call statist countries, and they will eagerly go and vote to turn our country into the kind of country that they fled from. So you let in a lot of, well, Venezuelans voted for socialism. What are Venezuelans going to do if they come to America? Vote for socialism. All right. First of all, this is not a crazy argument, right? It is true that people in general, public opinion is usually supportive of the policies that a country has. And so when you see a country that has bad policies, normally it does mean those policies are popular in that country. All right. But still I say, look, let's analyze this carefully, all right? And also look at the numbers. All right, so it's one thing to say immigrants will have somewhat different views than native-born Americans. It's another thing to say they want to go and bring the whole system crashing down, which is quite different. So as you probably know, so anyone idea what would be the Democrat-Republican ratio be for Indian Americans?
50-50, but depending on
Not 50, no.
20
Yes.
to 1 maybe?
Yes. Yeah, it's about 4 to 1. It's about 4 to 1. All right, right now, a point that I make, so yes, so Indians are very democratic, and yet, if you look at, first of all, their income. So Indian Americans are actually the highest income ethnicity in the United States. You guys beat Jews now. Jews are number 2, right? So go India, right? So you managed to go and beat the Jews, right? But on top of that, Indians are the most socially conservative people in terms of their behavior. So it is very odd for them to actually be in the Democratic Party. It seems like in terms of both their economic situation and their actual social condition, they would be natural Republicans. And this is something where it's like, so why do you think that is? Why do you think that is? So again, the perverted Republican answer is always, well, they just want welfare and that's why they're Democrats, right? How about, why is the richest group in America also so Democratic? What's going on there? Right? It's like, could it be that you're jerks to them and people who naturally do belong in your party just don't like you are not nice to them and so they don't feel welcome? Could it be that? So anyway, in the book I go over more evidence on this, but I think that actually does fit. But in any case, this problem of immigrants coming to vote for policies that will turn their new country into their old country, I say that it's greatly overstated. So first of all, it is true that non-natives are more socially conservative and more economically left-wing. But first of all, the difference is actually quite marginal. So there's a lot of people who go and say, look, immigrants are more left-wing. And then people in the say, like, okay, how much more? How much more? Are they Stalinists? Like, what are we talking about? Is it like 1% more left-wing? Is it twice as left-wing? In terms of party membership, then it is quite lopsided. But when you go and just ask people, what are your actual policy views, then we see that immigrants are actually more socially conservative. So especially weird for them to be in the Democratic Party, right? But also, and then just a little bit more economically left-wing, right? With more extreme patterns for the least educated. But here's another one. Non-natives have low turnout. Non-natives who are allowed to vote are much less likely to vote. Which if you think they're bad voters, you should be happy that they don't vote, all right? And especially the least educated voters have very low turnout, right? Which, again, some people say, and that's another bad thing about them, like, look, either say they vote badly or complain that they vote rarely, but don't do both. That doesn't make much sense. All right, now a last one that deserves to get attention. There is a view that a lot of research backs up, not all, but a lot, that says that one of the best predictors of support for the welfare state is ethnic homogeneity. So Scandinavia had their biggest welfare states back when the countries were almost entirely blonde. And as they've let in more immigrants, the welfare state has diminished somewhat. It hasn't gone away by any means, right? And the usual story is that people support the welfare state not out of self-interest, not because I want money for me, but because I want to go and take care of our people. And when you have higher levels of immigration, this undermines this idea of the country as a family where we all take care of each other, which some people think is terrible. On the other hand, I'll say, the idea of the country as a family, is it not an extremely authoritarian view? Maybe even totalitarian, right? So like if you had to get permission from your parents to go and date someone, what would they say? A lot of times they would say, no, you do not have my permission to date that person. That person's bad. No, right? Or you want to go and say, I don't know, visit India. You know, I don't think my dad's happy that I came to visit India. It's like, I don't want my son going there. What could I think of all the things that could happen? All right, so the key part of the family is by caring about each other, you also want to control each other. It is hard to go and preserve individual freedom when you think about other people in your country as being that close to you. Right? So I say actually part of what you need for a free society is having a lower level of identification with other people in your country so that you do not think that you cannot bear to allow them to do something that you don't approve of. There's two bodies of evidence that I think are much better and more systematic about the dangers of immigration. So one of them is looking at the long-run effects of ancestry. But let me just talk about the effects of IQ. Right, so it is a fact that IQs are generally higher in richer countries. And plausibly, a lot of this is causal. That it goes from people in the country are smarter to the country's doing better. Although there also turns out to be great evidence that the causation goes the other way too. And if you grow up in a third world orphanage, this actually, it doesn't just make you shorter, and it actually reduces your intelligence in adulthood, right? Now, what this means is, so we're just to back up. All right, so one thing is to say, all right, so like, we're nervous about it going and accepting low IQ immigrants from other countries. And this is one where, again, you really need to actually do the math and say, well, what do the actual statistical estimates say? So I actually did this. So my colleague Garrett Jones went and did the estimates, and I took his own numbers and say, what do your numbers imply would happen if everyone in the world just moved to the United States? And we just had the average IQ for the world. And yeah, the answer turned out to be that again. All right, because while IQ does matter, the effect was small enough, was sufficiently small that the gains of moving people to the higher productivity country were actually totally overwhelmed it. Now the other thing is that is actually the wrong comparison to do, because since a lot of the difference in intelligence between rich countries and poor countries is actually caused by severe poverty in the third world, that the IQ of humanity would actually rise if you could go and get them to better conditions. Now finally, even if the complaint were true, why not just let people come in to work but not vote? All right, let's see. So, let's see. I think I'll just read the first line here and then stop. Why not tear down these walls? Tell me why you guys should not be allowed to come to the United States. And see if you can convince me. Maybe you're right. Maybe you should have to stay here, but I don't think so. All right. Yes, please.
Yeah, one thing I thought was that I understand the argument based on the receiving country, but what about the country?
Great. So the brain drain argument.
Brain drain and productivity.
Yes, you're right. So the brain drain argument. So first of all, the argument makes sense, and it says that when you have higher immigration, so this allows people who are smarter or more ambitious or more entrepreneurial to leave, and isn't that bad for the country that's left behind? And the answer is maybe. And it's like, well, so what else is going on? Well, so one big thing that happens is that people go and migrate, and then they send money home, remittances. All right, so is it bad for the family members of the immigrants working in Dubai that they're there? And the answer is, yeah, almost certainly not. They're sending home a pile of money, which then is enriching the rest of the family and thereby the country they're coming from. So that's one, is just getting remittances. Another one is getting business connections. So someone migrates and they establish a business in the United States, they make business connections, which then makes it possible for them to go and establish business connections with people back in their home country. So this is another very common thing that actually really does happen, which is that migrants go and the initial movements, you've lost someone, that person is able to make such better connections, which they then can connect people in the home country. And of course, there's also retirement. A lot of people want to go to another country to work, but then when they retire, it's like, I actually do feel more comfortable back in my original country, and my money will go really far back in that country. I'll be the richest man in my village back in the US. So anyway, so we've got these. On the other hand, though, you have lost the skills. So we've got some effects that seem good, some that seem bad for the receiving, for the sending country. So how can we know? Well, so I say that like the best answer is we can look. There are a few cases in the world where a very low-income area was given open borders with a very high-income area, and we can actually see what happened to the low-income area. So Puerto Rico is the one that I know very well. So yes, over half of all people of Puerto Rican descent have left the island. If you go to Puerto Rico, it is virtually the richest island in the whole Caribbean. It looks like all of these other effects, the benefits of the remittances and the business connections, and also the retirement communities, which are big, all of these actually more than balance the loss of talent. Another example is French Guiana. So French Guiana in South America has open borders with France. French Guiana is in the European Union. Country in South America is in the European Union. It is also much richer than the surrounding areas, right? So it does seem like, there's a couple other examples. There's some poor islands, or originally poor islands, that have open borders with Australia or New Zealand. And again, it seems like it's not just that people leave the islands and everyone who stays then suffers, but rather we have all these offsetting gains which more than compensate for that. Now, the other thing to understand is, to a large extent, brain drain is caused by immigration restrictions. Because what is one way to get into a country? Be Albert Einstein. All right, so if only geniuses can get in, then yes, you're going to disproportionately lose your smart people. But what if you didn't need to be a genius? What if you could be an Uber driver and still come? So then you would at least be, we would not be so much just taking off high skilled workers. We'd be getting low skilled workers too. Yes, you had a question?
One thing is that one of the India's most developed state is Kerala, and that state actually has most expats outside of India.
Yes.
And they go to Dubai a lot.
Right.
But my question is this: that
is that where Bangalore is?
Sorry.
No, it's not.
It's
So
a state. It's a
yeah.
It's a
Yes.
province.
Okay.
It's a state. So anyway, but my question is that so I agree with your argument. I've also read your book, by the way. But how do we go from here? So do you how should the US go on and now sort of liberalize immigration more? So what should they do now practically in terms of practicality? And also US has a lot of illegal immigrants. And so how do you then go and maybe document them properly, and how do you sort of make sure that at least
right.
they are okay?
Yeah, so how do we go from here? Honestly, like I know what I do. So I go and I wrote a best-selling comic book about it, and I do debates and talks. I honestly can say I think that Open Borders is the most persuasive book that I've ever written. It's one where I think that if a reasonable, fair-minded person reads it, they will actually predictably change their minds in a much more pro-immigration direction. Of course, you may also find out there's just not that many reasonable, open-minded people in the world. That's life. So, what needs to be done? So honestly, we've got to get someone more persuasive than me. I need to persuade someone more persuasive than me, and by a lot. I've got to get someone who has a lot more charisma, much greater ability to go and win people over. It's hard, right? I know that it is a very hard sell. Right? When I go, so I was just talking to the Mont Pelerin Society about this. I did a special session on this. These are people who are normally very pro-free market, very anti-government, and yet the whole circle was coming up with complaints about immigrants and how terrible they are, right? And I'm trying to go and address it, but the complaints come faster than the responses, right? They can complain at 10 times the speed that I can respond, right? And a lot of it really is this extreme innumeracy where it's look, there was a terrorist attack, so we shouldn't let immigrants in, and it's well, shouldn't we go and compare the total gains to the total losses? No. Right? If one death is too much. And it's well, what about COVID? Weren't you saying how ridiculous it is to say if it saves one life, we should keep the country locked down for another year? Yeah, that's different. One thing is immigration. The other thing is a disease. And it's look, it's the same principle. Should government go and have policies that destroy trillions of dollars of wealth to save one life? Should it? Right? Should we go and have our whole society based on nothing is more important than staying safe, and you should just not live, you should not do anything fun, you should not leave your house, just stay there. It's I don't want to get hurt here. I'm risking myself, and I will say I've walked like few times I tried to be a pedestrian in India. That's where I've said, okay, safety first here. Yes, today I did try walking to the mosque by the Red Fort, and after about 45 seconds, I'm like, look, I can't make it. I don't see a sidewalk. There's like everything's crazy. You know, like, I just went back to my car. Like, no, but sometimes it gets that bad, but normally not. Normally, it's like there's a small risk and it's a small risk that's totally worth taking. I mean, honestly, it's the same thing. A baby. I mean, imagine you got a newborn baby. Like, how do we know he's not the next Hitler? It's like, all right. Like, I can't prove it. I guess there's a chance, but does that mean we should not be happy that the baby was born because there's some very tiny chance he's the next Hitler? Or should we say, look, overwhelmingly likely he's just going to be a nice person who will be loved and appreciated and will contribute? Oh yes, and then the second, yes. So,
follow-up question to this. It is that would you say that like to the US, illegal immigration
yes,
the US is better than having less immigration?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, yes. Yeah, so look, yeah, illegal immigration is fantastic, right? It's not as good as legal immigration because a legal immigrant can go and work in any job and use their skills. Illegal immigrants normally, even if they're very high skilled, they have to go and take a menial job. So what we've seen in the US is that just giving someone legal status on average raises earnings about 20 or 30% because it expands the range of jobs they can do. If you're a legal worker in the US, you're going to be working in agriculture or a restaurant or in a hotel, or you'll be self-employed. There's a number of jobs where there's just very little immigration enforcement, but you're not going to be able to work as an illegal doctor. You're not going to be able to work illegally at Google. So there's a lot of other jobs where you were limited, and so legal immigration is better. But yes, like the American obsession with illegal immigration, when people say, like, I'm always tempted to say, like, I've tried it many times, it's never worked. Just to say, well, look, I agree, it's terrible that the immigrants are illegal. How about we just make them legal? And like, no. All right, so it's not really that you just oppose illegal immigration, it's that you want that kind of immigration to be illegal.
Who's the most influential person
Let's see, the person I've influenced most in immigration, let's see, that's a good question. Let's see. So actually, I'll say that I think I've had some influence on Michael Clemens. So I'm citing him. He's influenced me, but I think I've influenced him back. And he's been a major advisor to Biden on immigration. I mean, look, the honest truth is that the U.S. system. So, like, when is the last time that U.S. immigration law was fundamentally changed? Any idea what the year where the U.S. actually fundamentally changed its immigration law?
2002?
Nope. 1965. 1965. Because in the US, it is very hard to fundamentally change any law ever because you have to get 51% of the House, 51% of the Senate. You have to get the president to sign, and the Supreme Court has to also say that it's okay. So you got all of those things. So what's happening is that within this law, presidents can go and just make things easier or harder. They can enforce the law more or less. What Biden wound up doing was just reducing enforcement and making it easier to go and come and say, I want asylum. And then there's a big difference. If you say I want asylum and say, great, we'll put you in prison while we decide whether you should get asylum. That doesn't sound like a very good deal, does it? On the other hand, if you say, okay, well, you are free to go and live here while we figure out whether you deserve asylum, it's like, all right, good deal. Yes, please.
Thank you, Bryan, for your talk. So I was actually reading like Rothbard, and he kind of has like a different views on immigration, and he feels like the borders are kind of more of an extension of private property rights. So what's your stance on that? Because he feels like, if we restrict immigration, then it kind of holds property rights, and then what's your
stance? Great question. So Murray Rothbard immigration. First of all, I'd like to point out that until 1989, he had exactly my view. Right? And then he changed his mind without ever even explaining what was wrong with the original view. To me, that's very suspicious. I've changed my mind, and whenever I change my mind, I can explain exactly where I was wrong because I don't change my mind for no reason, right? So I think that the correct story actually is that he changed his mind because he had new friends and he wanted to go and revise the views so he could fit in with his friends. Now, just in terms of the substance of his later view, if you really think that a country is like private property, then you should be a socialist, because it is a socialist idea, right? If you say, look, you can't come into my house without my permission, so you shouldn't be able to come into the country without the country's permission. Okay. You can't open a church in my house without my permission, so you shouldn't be able to open a church in a country without the country's permission. So no freedom of religion, now we're Saudi Arabia. Can you have a baby in my house without my permission? No, in that case, you should have to have a permit from the government to have a baby. And like it is I actually have a name for this idea. I call it anarcho-totalitarianism, where you start saying I'm an anarchist, and you end up with a Stalinist state where the government is allowed to go and do anything because this is all belongs to we, the people of this country. So yeah. Now on top of that, Rothbard also then embraced a bunch of empirical claims about how bad immigration was, which again, like here, I think I've responded. So honestly, like in his earlier work, he was very good, and he said, look, the case for the case for protectionism, the reductio ad absurdum, is the Caplan family should produce everything in the Caplan household, and we shouldn't trade with non-Caplans. And we should grow our own food. We should make our own refrigerators, right? And like how ridiculous that would be. And then he actually did apply the analogy and say it's the same idea with we should not go and allow anyone else into into our house, because like anything else there would be a problem. Like we should not allow a plumber to come in and fix our toilet. No, we should fix everything ourselves, right? And it's the same logic of trade, which is trade is mutually beneficial, and like just the way that he changed his mind really on a dime. Actually, I actually had a publication dispute over this very question, because Walter Block asked me to write my intellectual autobiography, and I wrote about how I thought it was terrible that Rothbard changed his mind on this with no explanation, and I thought it was just really sleazy of him. And then Walter said, yeah, you need to go and cut that out of your autobiography, Bryan. And I'm like, it's my autobiography. Like, you can't make me chill. Like, you think I'm lying, Walter? You think that I actually am making up a story about my othis is really what happened? And he's like, yeah, but like, no. So actually it went on for years and years, and finally, and he would email me and say, Bryan, just give me the essay and let me do what I want. I'm like, nope. And finally, after like 5 years, like, fine, I will run it without alterations.
What's your stance on like the immigrants getting access to public facilities?
Right. Yeah. So what I'd say is, I don't see it as more unfair than Americans getting access. I say the reasonable question is like thinking about net fiscal effect. So are people going and receiving more in benefits than they're getting in taxes? When you're doing that math, there are a number of complexities that you should consider, like, okay, what about their kids? Their kids will go to school, but their kids also will grow up one day and they will pay taxes. So like definitely if you can get more immigrants by saying immigrants pay taxes but don't get benefits, then definitely, because the gains of immigration are so enormous, and the benefits of the government benefits on the other hand are just trivial by comparison. Right. And so I guess my main reaction is like, if these programs are so bad, then why do you have them in the first place? Which is a good question, I think.